Good morning, one and all. Here we are, Wednesday morning. We get an opportunity to get into God's Word, get our dose of it, and get our day kicked off right. Hey, this morning I want to talk about a passage that Paul wrote to Titus over in Titus, the second chapter. It talks about grace. You know, we hear a lot about grace today, and about grace covers all types of things, and we're saved by grace, and and all those things are true. But there's also an obligation to God's grace. Paul writes to Titus here in Titus chapter 2. Paul makes a statement beginning in verse 11. He says, "For the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men, teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in the present age." Here's something about grace. God's grace obviously is found within Christ. And Paul also said in Acts 20 and verse 32, when he's talking to the Ephesian elders, that he is going to commend them to the grace of God, which is able to build them up to an inheritance. Now he's talking about the Word. He says to the Word of His grace. So contained within God's umbrella of grace also includes His Word. And I think that's what Paul is hitting on here, is that God's Word of grace, it does something. For first of all, it says that it teaches us. We find within God's Word what is right, what is wrong, what is sin, what is error, what is truth, and so on and so forth. It's contained within God's Word. It teaches us he goes on to say, to deny ungodliness. But it seems like in the religious world, what we find is you just go ahead and live ungodly because God's grace is going to take care of that. When we consider what God has done and made possible through and by Jesus Christ, we have an obligation to do something and resent. Not that we should do something. Sometimes I hear people say, we should live differently because of God's grace. We should live differently because of His forgiveness. No, it's not that we should. It's that we have to. There's not a gray area there. It's not something we just toss up in the air. One day I'm going to, the next day I'm not going to, and so on and so forth. No, it teaches us that we are to deny ungodliness, and that is defined by God, not by us, and worldly lust. Here's the idea, is that how grace is so misused and misapplied is that, if I say that I'm a Christian, if I profess that I have been saved, well, I can just kind of roll with the punches, so to speak. I can just kind of live any way that I want to, and God's grace is going to take care of that. Not necessarily. If our attitude is such as I'm going to kind of do what I want, kind of do the best I can, and let God's grace take it from there, I've got the wrong attitude all to begin with. Here's an absolute. This is what Paul said. This is an absolute of what I need to be doing, because His Word of grace tells us what to and what not to do, teaching us to deny ungodliness. Well, what's ungodliness? Well, His Word of grace tells me that. Worldly lust, well, what are those? Well, His Word tells me what worldly lust is. And this is how I should live: soberly, righteously, and godly. This isn't a suggestion. This is something that is absolutely required of us. It's not something that I should try to do. It's something that I've got to do. And it's a process, of course. I understand that. But notice what Paul said. Verse 11, "For the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men." God allows us to be saved. And God has given us a way to be saved. And that is through Jesus Christ. So because of His grace that's made possible something that we need and we cannot do on our own, now I have an obligation. I have to be in His Word. I've got to understand what is right, what is wrong. How do I need to live? What do I need to get rid of? Kind of like what Paul wrote in the book of Ephesians and in the book of Colossians. Putting off that old man and putting on the new man. And as he said in Romans 12, verses 1 and 2, not conforming to this world. And as he said in Romans 6 and verse 1, shall I continue to sin that grace may abound? God forbid, or certainly not. And so when we just kind of have this attitude, I'm kind of like the black sheep of God's family. There's no black sheep in God's family, not at all. We water down, we mock, we make fun of the very grace and the mercy of God. And so he says that we should live soberly, righteously, and godly, not continuing with the same mindset and lifestyles that I've been living. No, I have to change those. I have to get in his word of grace and find out, what do I need to cut out of my life? What do I need to change? What do I need to adjust? And it's a process, but the older we get and the longer that we're at it, there should be fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer things that get the better of us. But again, we find God's grace has given us this information. God's grace, his word of grace, teaches us, instructs us, guides us, gives us the information that we need in order to be pleasing to God. And so I'm going to leave you with that. So here we have this idea of grace, is that his grace gives us the information that we need in his word of grace, Acts 20, verse 32. It teaches us what's right. It teaches us what's wrong. It teaches us the lifestyles that are acceptable. It teaches us the mindsets that are acceptable and that is not acceptable. All of this is contained within this umbrella of God's grace. And so it's information we need that we would not have unless God gave it to us. And isn't it great, as the psalmist said in Psalm 56, it says, I praise your word. Isn't it great that we have God's word to give us that information to be pleasing to him? And so there's your dose of God's word today. I hope it'll do you some good. I hope it'll get your wheels turning. And Lord willing, we'll get back tomorrow and get another dose of God's word and get our day kicked off right. So I'll see you then. I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you in the AM.